80 years ago, the Second World War, one of the worst tragedies of humanity, quieted down. The memory of it still influences the politics and values of many countries. But today, that same memory has become a real information weapon in the hands of Russians. Kremlin propaganda rewrites history in an attempt to usurp the victory and does not want to talk about the alliance with Hitler at the beginning of World War II. History has become a tool in Russia's hybrid war against Europe, and Ukraine turned out to be its first target. How does the Kremlin today distort the role of Ukrainians in the history of World War II? Why does Russia use the myth of the Great Patriotic War in its aggression against Ukraine? And how has historical memory become one of the fronts of a new hybrid war against Europe? The cult of victory and the creation of the myth of the Great Patriotic War was the main task of both Soviet and Russian ideologists. Historians point out that its formation fell during the reign of Leonid Brezhnev in the 1960s to 70s. It was then that the myth of the Great War, the most important ideological foundation of the Soviet regime, was created. At the same period, the formation of KGB agent Vladimir Putin took place. The USSR collapsed, and Russia proclaimed itself its legal successor. Practiced Soviet methodologies began to be scaled up, and the myth of the Great Patriotic War became the basis of the new authoritarian regime in Russia. In addition, an aggressive revision of history began. The special role of the Russians in World War II became the central idea of propaganda. Putin repeatedly stated that the participation of Ukrainians, Belarusians, and other nations that were part of the USSR was not essential, and the Russians could have won the war without them.
Если мы посмотрим статистику времен Второй мировой войны,
if we take the statistics of the Second World War, it will turn out, and what will turn out? It is all there. The greatest losses in the Great Patriotic War were suffered by the RSFSR, which means that the war was won, I don't want to offend anyone, but mainly at the expense of human and industrial resources of the Russian Federation.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a huge number of foreign researchers started working in Russian archives. And all Sovietologists, all historians, American, British, French, German, Finnish, tried to get into Russia. This is a huge number of conferences, scientific formulas, common projects, and this is where the convergence of positions in the assessment of history was formed. The second layer of the problem. This is actually the political level. In fact, all the recent presidents of the United States of America signed some kind of documents with Russia on the assessment of the common contribution to the defeat of Nazism and fascism in World War II. This was, of course, more of a declaration, but it is very important for understanding the atmosphere that was created in the elites of foreign countries regarding modern Russia. After all, it was mainly about Russia, and all this forms a kind of zone of mutual understanding, a zone of associative consolidated attitude to the results of the Second World War, to the role of Russia. And in this way, Russia asserts its right not just to be the victor in World War II, but also asserts its right to influence world affairs. It would seem what World War II and modern politics have in common. But here we go.
The past has become the Kremlin's main tool in promoting its influence in the world. Monuments to the Soviet soldier in Europe are in essence objects of influence of the Russian Federation. They gather thousands of Russian migrants for political actions. So-called Russian centers, annual pseudo-historical forums, and tons of propaganda work to hide Soviet crimes. And the sacrifice of the Soviet people during World War II serves to justify the crimes of the current Russian regime. At the beginning of April this year, another propaganda forum, Memory of the Victors, was held in Moscow. Russian media reported that the event was attended by representatives of 52 countries from Europe, Asia, Africa, and America. However, all of them are participants of the Russian initiative Immortal Regiment. One of the main topics for discussion turned out to be the alleged escalation of Nazism and Russophobia in Europe.
We did not just win this war, but just these very same European citizens were liberated. It should not be forgotten.
Russia is always selling the past, and it has no model of the future of any kind, because modern Russia has no achievements today. They have not flown to Mars. They have not created an iPhone and so on. So they have to sell something that will be bought by society. And this is something that always evokes emotions. What evokes emotion? It's something positive, laughter, joy, and so on. But we realize that laughter, joy are not really there. So they need to sell other emotions. They need to sell emotions of empathy, pain, suffering. The strongest emotion that has been ingrained in the historical memory over generations is the memory of war. And any family, whether in Ukraine, Russia, or Europe, many families also experience this tragedy. The second interesting point: who do people in Europe associate victory in World War II with? The Russians. Why? Because, unfortunately, under the Soviet Union in the Western countries, in the countries of Europe, we were all here, unfortunately, Russians. If we look at, let's say, monuments to the Soviet soldier, there the monument is associated with the Soviet Russian soldier. We will not find anywhere in Europe a monument to a Georgian, Jewish, Kazakh, Moldovan soldier, and so on. Therefore, this identification of the Soviet Union's victory in World War II as the rightful heir of Russia is the basis for the promotion of all these narratives that relate to World War II and that Russia sells as its victory.
Back in 2007, there was a high-profile conflict over the bronze soldier in Estonia. The authorities in Tallinn moved the monument from the city center to a military cemetery. This provoked mass protests by ethnic Russians, as well as riots known as Bronze Nights. The Kremlin called these actions a rehabilitation of Nazism and organized a major cyber attack on the Estonian government.
Это Эстония, А я работала в детском саду, где у меня ходили дети и их родители. Вот этот памятник базовый мост строит. Да пошел ты! Сколько тебе...
Similar events took place in Poland in 2016 as a reaction to the adoption of the decommunization law and the mass demolition of Soviet monuments. After the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the monument to the liberators of Riga was demolished in Latvia, which the Kremlin regarded as fascization of society. At the same time, they silenced the facts of the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states and Poland in 1939 to 40. There are immortal regiment actions in Germany, France, Czech Republic, Serbia, and Austria. All of them are accompanied by Russian and Soviet symbols, creating the illusion of mass support for Russia in the world.
The Russian Federation has constantly waged this hybrid warfare, soft power in the form of cultural centers. And today, 45 Russian houses have been deployed around the world, which will fuel the hysteria of victory until May 9th. And this propaganda, it has always worked under the Soviet Union and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's a claim that this territory is controlled by us. You have a huge number of Russian speakers, actually ethnic Russians. You have monuments that we exploit. You have artists who perform in Russian in your halls. Your artists perform in Russian in our halls. And this is how zones of influence are formed. That is why in some countries, like in the Baltic states, it is faster, and in others it is slower, like in Ukraine. And in Belarus, we see that Russia has artificially slowed down these processes. It is getting rid of the Soviet historical heritage very slowly. It is very difficult to do this because the inertia of the worldview of many citizens is such that it does not allow to reorganize very quickly. Back in 2010 in Ukraine, about 80% of people considered Victory Day as a holiday, one of the biggest holidays. Here are the statistics. And it was only the large-scale invasion, first 2014, and then the large-scale invasion that drastically lowered that number. So it's very difficult to achieve rapid evolution by simple methods of culture, education. And when there are such disasters, extreme political and military disasters like today, humanitarian catastrophes, then society is more quickly reorganized at the individual level, at the group level, and at the collective level.
то общество быстрее перестраивается и на индивидуальном уровне, и на групповом, и на коллективном.
Ukraine has become Russia's first target in its hybrid aggression. Russian political technologists and propagandists have been infiltrating the Ukrainian information field for years, promoting the thesis of a united nation and a common history. May 9th was a central event for Russian propaganda in Ukraine and the world. Putin and Kremlin ideologists, in particular Vladislav Surkov, have created a political technology that simultaneously unites and manipulates the masses, substituting the memory of the victims of World War II with the ideology of Russian greatness. 2014, the Revolution of Dignity takes place in Ukraine. The pro-Russian president flees the country to Russia. From that moment on, the issue of shared historical memory became one of the main issues in the Kremlin's anti-Ukrainian propaganda. Ukrainians are essentially excluded from the Russian version of the Soviet victory, and the very fact of Ukraine's independence is presented as a betrayal. Russian propaganda explained the annexation of Crimea and territories in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in 2014 as protection of the population from some Nazis, and Putin motivated the full-scale invasion in 2022 by the so-called denazification of all of Ukraine.
We will aim at demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine.
What Russia is doing, if you read Russian scientific studies, so-called yes, and it's very interesting that this dictatorship is so bureaucratic that it is even ridiculous. They begin to put a scientific basis for the growth of Nazism in Ukraine, and they take different facts. Let's remember the situation in Ukraine, which was very dramatically scaled by Russia, and this is one of these stones, the foundation of the fact that we were called Nazis. From a certain time in Ukraine, it became a rule to celebrate Stepan Bandera's birthday on January 1st and Intercession Day, with certain demonstrations accompanied by torchlight processions. Usually we analyzed at a certain point. Usually in such marches there were maybe 2,000 to 2,500 people. A very small group of people who expressed their thoughts like this. So these torchlight processions were given almost primary attention as a fact of manifestation of Nazism in Ukraine. And what is it associated with? Look at the torch processions of the brown shirts in 1939. Same thing. Building an associative row, Russia in this way modeled this right radical, just large-scale mood in Ukraine. And this is a bridge, roughly speaking, to the brains of Europeans. Why? Because they also have it as a deep historical trauma, deep emotions. And now, when we are already moving on to why they call us Nazis and fascists. Now, when Russia says that we are fighting fascism and Nazism here and sells this in its narratives to Europe, it is again appealing to the same historical memory of Europeans and saying, look, remember, we fought together with you against this nasty thing, against this brown plague, against Hitler. Yes, we won together. We were side by side. And now the same thing is growing in Ukraine. Yes, and we are fighting it. So why do you support Ukraine?
The Ukrainian National Liberation Movement is demonized in the history of Russia, just as the Ukrainian army is today. After all, they are defending their independence from the totalitarianism of the past and present. Historians claim that Ukrainians suffered millions of casualties from the Nazi and communist regimes in World War II. During the German advance eastward, all of Ukraine was occupied. The total number mobilized from its territory to the Red Army was about 8 million. In addition, Ukrainians fought in the armies of Poland, the United States, Canada, and France. Hundreds of thousands fought against the Nazis in the ranks of partisans and rebels. In 2017, the famous American historian Timothy Snyder, speaking in the German Bundestag, said that it was the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and the territory of modern Ukraine that was the main target of Nazi German expansion to the east.
During World War II, about 33 million people of various nationalities of the Soviet Union passed through the Red Army. Among them, about 8 million inhabitants of Ukraine. We don't say citizens because it was a quasi-republic, and there was no such citizenship as the Ukrainian SSR. My colleagues and I on documents, it's all documented, archived in our archives and Moscow archives. we proved that only in 1941 to 45, during this period, more than 7 million people were mobilized. And if we add those who were mobilized before 1939, in 1939 to 1940, we get about 8 million. Also, proportionally, you can trace the share of Ukrainians in the award lists among the heroes of the Union, among the holders of the Order of Glory, among those who received medals. To say that it was possible to defeat Germany and its allies without Ukraine is speculation.
In addition to expanding the scale of presence in this victory, it downs the presence of others. How is this happening, for example, with Ukrainians? We see that recently we are very often associated there with some crimes that took place during the Second World War, which were committed by the Nazis. And all of a sudden now some interesting facts are surfacing that these here, it turns out, were Ukrainians both in Babi Yar shooting and in Katyn. It was not Hitlerites who burned there, and some other crimes were not done by them, but it was all done by collaborators and done by Ukrainians. What Russia does, it associates Ukrainians with the crimes that were done by the collaborators. Again, the Banderites, another myth, were sympathizers of the Germans. That's the only role it associates Ukrainians with in this war, and displacing us from that huge stratum of sacrifices that we have suffered, and that indeed we deservedly invested body, soul, blood, national genome in this victory.
The main perpetrator is the Nazis, the fascists, the Banderites, and we must understand perfectly well that we continue the great work of the victorious fathers and grandfathers of ours.
Russian state propaganda in every possible way relates the images of a Soviet soldier and a Russian military man, and Ukrainians are endowed with the image of a so-called fascist, which has long lived in the mass consciousness of Russians and Europeans. Propaganda cliches mobilize Russian society to allegedly continue the struggle of their ancestors against imaginary enemies, using the slogans, "We can do it again," and "Our tanks will be in Prague and Berlin again." World War II symbols are actively used in modern warfare, state awards, medals, and titles, copying the aesthetics of the USSR, actually creating a simulation of reality.
The Russian propaganda machine has developed all these stamps and cliches to such an extent that it has created an actual system of matrices. When you have a message, and depending on who you want to target, you just change the geography, the name of the country, and it works. A prime example, let's remember Lavrov's June 16, 2022 BBC interview when he was asked that question if Russia attacked Ukraine. He said, no, Russia did not attack Ukraine. Russia declared a special military operation when it was no longer possible, and he goes on to say, to explain to the West that it was behaving very badly, that Ukraine was there, this and that, and so on. And now change the name of Ukraine in this answer. Russia started against the Baltics, Poland, Kazakhstan, a special military operation, because it could not explain in any other way that here you are behaving badly. This is a demonstration of what a matrix is, and there are a lot of such matrices, including the Second World War.
It's absolutely not for nothing that Putin is next to our heroes of the Great Patriotic War. This is a clear continuation of this victory, especially Crimea. Yes, this is another victory for us.
The Kremlin falsifies history to justify its aggression and imperial ambitions, but the last 11 years clearly show Russia is waging the same war as the USSR against Ukrainian independence and identity.
Putin,
like Stalin, needs an empire. And without Ukraine, the empire cannot be conceived. This Ukrainian factor, it came to a head immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We don't know much about it. We all start somehow with Putin. And even under Yeltsin, in the offices of the Federal Security Service FSB, they began to discuss projects to bring Ukraine back into the sphere of Moscow's exclusive influence. Already then, and I think that before Putin came to the Yeltsin family, these scenarios were already being worked out, and then gradually realized in the form of hybrid means of warfare, Tuzla, division of the Black Sea Fleet. If you look at the whole configuration of Russian-Ukrainian relations, everything fits into such a logical picture. all the puzzles fall into place. The war could not have been avoided because Ukraine did not want to return to this colonial empire.
May 9th, the central date in the Kremlin's mythology, is today supported by Russia's apparent agents in Europe, the prime ministers of Slovakia, Robert Fico, and Hungary, Viktor Orban. Fico will be one of the guests invited personally by Putin to Moscow. In addition to Fico, Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić is also expected to arrive. Participants in Putin's war against Ukraine will also march on Red Square in a traditional march. In parallel, Russian agents of influence will activate in European cities to destabilize the political situation in the EU.
Russia exploits historical knowledge for ideological propaganda purposes, and the basis for the construction of this knowledge about the war is falsified data, falsified or artificially modeled concepts that allow to instill in modern Russian citizens, the hinterland people, as the leaders of Russia themselves contemptuously call their society, a memory model that will reflect the exclusive role of Russians not only in history, but also in the modern world. This is a new construction designed to form for Russia an image of an exclusive winner who has special rights to victory. And these rights should be recognized not only in the post-Soviet area, but also by the world community.
The full burden of fighting today, as in the Great Patriotic War, lies first and foremost on our soldiers, on those who are on the front lines, on sergeants, platoon leaders, company leaders, combatants, riflemen and sappers, scouts and communicators, on the crews of tanks and fighting vehicles, on artillerymen and pilots. All our fighters fight bravely, decisively.
The communist regime turned the memory of World War II into a convenient template for the formation of Soviet identity. Official rituals became a tool of mobilization, which is still actively used in Russia today. For 80 years, the propaganda picture simply supplanted the real truth about the war. That is why Ukraine on this historic day continues to defend itself from Putin's aggression. While Russia is fighting for the past, Ukraine and Europe are fighting for the future and the truth that will remain in the history books.
Information is as much a strategy as I would draw on a battlefield map or a diagram of a nuclear missile launch, because you and I can see that information is as powerful a weapon as any other, as the iron with which they kill on the field. Why do they have Stalin as an idol again now? Because this is the story that is accepted and acceptable to today's Russia. The story that there were repressions, that there were millions of dead, that there were gulags. We don't hear about the gulags in Russia now. No, we only hear about how the Soviet Union built millions of factories. Again, why is Russia so terribly afraid, as it says, of rewriting history? It is not afraid that they will rewrite it or tell the truth about the victory. That the second front, as Zakharova shouted, was opened only in 44. But the fact that, let's say, Lend-Lease started in 41, and the fact that in 42, 43, British and American armies were already fighting in North Africa, in Sicily, further in Italy, so it kind of remains behind the scenes. Russia is afraid of rewriting another history, that it was part of a totalitarian state. The Soviet Union was part of, well, roughly speaking, the evil empire, which only showed a beautiful screen of internationalism, but here it was, strangling everyone and everything. Russia is doing the same thing now.
This war has been such a cognitive dissonance and an upheaval of consciousness for many people. In the West, we probably would not have been seen as a sovereign state, as a political nation, as a cultural huge community, as a huge mass, a whole continent belonging to European civilization, if not for this war. And it is the fact that Russia appeals to the Second World War, and does it very clumsily, sometimes deliberately and even cynically, that opens the eyes of many people to what is Rashism today.
Choosing the future for us, for Ukraine, certainly means being a strong part of the global world, regardless of what Putin wants.
The process of formation of the Ukrainian political nation during the Second World War was not completed. It is not completed today. Moreover, today in this museum there was an exhibition, Unfinished War. The logic is that for the people of Ukraine, the war for independence during the Second World War has not ended. Today we continue the war for independence. This is the logic of the historical process. We can argue 80 years later, other contexts, other people, other international configuration. But for the Ukrainian political nation, the quintessence of this issue is the creation of its own state, which will express the interests of the people of Ukraine. I emphasize, not the Ukrainian people, but the people of Ukraine, multinational in ethnic composition, in confessional composition. And we have this right historically. No one can grant it to us, lend it to us, impose it on us. This is our historical right, just like the right of the Russians to build their society, of the Belarusians, of the Germans, of the French. That's why memory models, official memory models, must come from our history.